But yeah, so essentially, um, the reason I wanted to hold this event today was because Mandem was set up to be like a progressive male space in opposition to some of the strange, like alt-right men movements that are kind of arising at the moment, to a degree at least. And there's a level of responsibility to address male mental health, I feel, on the platform. And I've kind of put it off for a little bit anyway. But there's also been like a growing conversation in the UK regarding like masculinity and mental health that have been dictated by the likes of Grace and Perry and recently Robert Webb, who's from the Peep Show, if anyone knows the Peep Show. And the question sort of to me then became like, can they truly speak on behalf of like all men, and do they truly understand masculinity themselves? Is the answer as simple as telling men not to man up? Like, is that really going to end toxic masculinity? Or is it something deeper? Is it like a reflection of, is toxic masculinity simply a reflection of capitalist society's desire to dominate? So, yeah, I hope I haven't blown your minds just yet. But, yeah, if the subject matter gets a bit too deep and any of you feel like crying, then we're all going to laugh at you and make you feel really silly and single you out. No, we're not actually going to do that, obviously. We're all going to have a good group cry at the end. Like Vince and me are going to cry in front of all of you. Yeah, so let me introduce these gentlemen next to me. I have Marcus on my closest right. He does some fascinating stuff. He's done some fascinating research into the invasion of social media in our everyday lives and how it affects mental health. We have one of our guests couldn't make it today. He like managed to break his ankle somehow or twist his ankle today, which is a bit unfortunate. It's a bit unfortunate. But we have the beautiful Olumide to replace him, who's a student at UE on the same campus as me. He does photography, and he's just a smart guy. And we've got Adam, who is actually a genius. So we've got a panel expert here for once. He's got a PhD in social anthropology from St. Andrews University, and explored masculinity, fatherhood, and kinship in Dominica, an island in the Caribbean. And then we've got Vince, who's just generally a don. He's he's probably like the most articulate man I've ever met, and he understands media subliminals better than anyone I know, and he works in transmedia and supports young artists as well. But yeah, like all these men are positive role models to me, and they're super friendly, so feel free to ask them anything. So the first question I want to throw out there, obviously the way, if you've been to our events before, we kind of like do them as a bit of an open discussion. So like at any point, if anyone wants to jump in and say something, like you're very welcome to do that. But I'll start by asking the panel a question. I'm a bit sniffly as well. It's cold. The weather's got me. How are the traditional ideas of masculinity a danger to male mental health? Is it tied to like expectations, like we saw in that video? I found it interesting how, one of the second dudes sort of mentions like he doesn't drive a nice whip yet, he doesn't own a house, those kind of things. Is it the expectations we have of ourselves as men? Someone want to jump on that? Go on, don't be shy.
Do I need this?
I'll hold this. This.
I was thinking about this in preparation, whether it's the kind of this male role model, this like idea of how we're supposed to be a kind of traditional male, and whether that's corrosive to men's happiness, or whether, in fact, also you could say it's true the other way around, that by the time you are making yourself conform with this particular idea of how a gender is supposed to be, that's a sign that your mental health is already kind of under duress in some way. That you're so alienated from yourself, to use the word that Marx used for that particular purpose, given that we're connecting this to capitalism, that you start to kind of lose that touch with yourself, and then do things that you feel will make others see you a different way, or make you have more value, I guess, of a particular kind that perhaps is not a form of value that we sort of innately recognise, but then have to sort of are trained to and are indoctrinated into believing in, as we become men.
What do you guys think?
Well, what kind of crops into my mind, specifically with that question, is for like an example. If you take an animal out of its right conditions and you put it in a cage and you've got three of them and you've got one of them that is acting quote unquote normal, one of them that is constantly trying to break out, and one of them that is doing something that looks a little bit weird, which one of those has the mental illness? So like, is in a society which is profoundly sick and has all these different kind of crooks and crannies and things that we know that we don't agree with, to be in that situation and to be completely fine, is that the mental illness, or is the signs, aggression's a big problem. Do you know what I mean? It's one of the symptoms of a lot of things that come out, but is that aggression actually your fault? Like, is that actually the humanity still poking its head out going, I'm still actually a human being, I'm still ready to make moves when we want to make moves and all those kind of things? So I think that, like, vaguely that's what comes to my head, and I think that, as the conversation goes on and it gets a bit more specific, maybe I can narrow it down, but instantaneously that's what it comes to me, because there is, even though I know that like gender roles right now is a bit of a dirty word, there is like an innate kind of sensibility within human beings, full stop. And part of that is to change environments when they're not it's never been perfect, but when there's a direction which you can go which is going to be more progressive for you, and we know we're in a situation, we don't want it to be stagnant in this particular position. So
do we quickly just want to define what actual hard traditional ideas of masculinity are and why they're a danger?
We also need to be more clear about mental health, because we're talking about it as if it's one thing, and like aggression is a symptom of certain kinds of mental health. Extreme diffidence is a symptom of other things. They're not all the same, and they're not all as related to the gender system.
Yeah, I think in this context, when I kind of referred to it, I kind of saw like mental health as almost just relating to just the mind of men. Do you know what I mean? Like not even as in like necessarily mental health
like
symptoms or like, do you know what I mean? But like
because you mentioned aggression, I just thought
yeah. But do you want to like define like give your definitions of what you think toxic masculinity are for a start?
No pressure then. I think the way I'd position the notion of traditional masculinities, at least, is in terms of a set of ideals that if you inhabit the body that's identified as being male within society, that you'll be expected to strive towards. And to a greater or lesser degree, you'll be able to achieve or come close to those ideals, but nobody ever truly embodies them. Not even the people who are held up on a pedestal as being the embodiments of something we call masculinity. And so in a way, that striving but not being able to achieve that particular realization of these different things, which I'll kind of give you a kind of a working definition, at least in terms of how I conceive of it, is in and of itself debilitating to mental well-being. On the note of mental well-being, before I get into, I know I'm skirting around the question like a politician or something, but in terms of mental health, I tend to see that more as an ongoing project rather than something that you have or don't have. And I think that's a good thing for us to all kind of keep in mind, is that those people who look like they might be kind of imbalanced, and when we were reasoning before talking about this event tonight with Elias and a few of us, that was something which kind of came up, was that it's this ongoing process rather than an end goal. Talk about this notion of happiness, which I think is something which gets sold to us across a whole range of different industries that kind of selling us happiness. But this everyday process of just being well is something which is slightly different, and which is maybe something which we need to be concentrating on rather than the destination. In terms of those ideals then, we're familiar with most of them. Ideas about being strong, being dominant, being respected, having a well-paying job, accruing a lot of the symbols that come with these particular set of ideals of masculinity, as was mentioned in the film. Cars. Also, there's something to do with sexuality as well. There are particular kinds of sexualities have valorized within this kind of dominant notion of masculinity. And then also masculinity is defined by what it's not meant to be, right? by femininity and softness. Like one of the most insulting things a 16-year-old boy could call another 16-year-old boy is moist, which is also the same thing that he refers to as being the destination in terms of his sexuality, right? Which is a funny kind of a thing going on there in terms of masculinity. I don't want to speak too much more on this point and kind of open it back out, but how is it, one of the questions that came earlier, how is it corrosive to mental health or to happiness? I'd say because it restricts our human potentials. And anything that restricts our human potential undermines our mental well-being, I think. So does it restrict your creativity in some way? If you're going to do certain things that might lead to you being called a pussy or something like this, and again, it's in that position in relation to femininity, right? Relation to the woman's female sexual organ as being kind of somehow taken away from masculinity in a funny kind of a way. Does shedding tears somehow undermine your masculinity in some way? All of these things, which are part of being human, are kind of off bounds for men, and then more off bounds for certain kinds of men according to where you're positioned in the society. So it's okay for Grayson Perry or somebody who's already achieved a certain level of status to be able to start talking about those vulnerabilities. But there's a really interesting poem in this book, which I'll read in a minute if anyone is interested, but it's about a guy crying on a tube. And so an everyday guy in the street crying on the tube, specifically a black guy, is that going to be as kind of tolerated or as kind of accepted as somebody like Grayson Perry or somebody on the TV? So just a few kind of points to think about.
Yeah. And I won't digress into this too much now, but it's interesting as well to break down and analyse whether the culture of toxic masculinity is a result of just like the patriarchal and like dominating nature of society, and if that actually affects women as well, because you do get, because I know we're focusing on men, but it's like how much does it affect women as well is an interesting point, but we'll come to that later. Who votes to hear the poem before we go any further? Anybody? You want to show hands? All right.
All right. So it was my birthday on the weekend, and I got given this book by my partner, and she told me it was going to be good. I'd not heard of the guy before. His name's Rahel Lionheart Cape, and the poem's called "The Man on the Northern Line Train," and I'll just read a little bit of it. At King's Cross, a single tear ran from his eye. He looked at me, ashamed, guilt-ridden by the loss. Can everyone hear me? At the back? Yeah, okay, I'll start again from that sentence. He looked at me ashamed, guilt-ridden by the loss, the spectacle. He avoided eye contact. There was a time when a man's tears were a defeat of some kind, an act of withdrawal from the role men were meant to play, always in character, rock hard, trapped beneath the rubble. If circumstances were different, would I have inquired further? Could I care for a man as I would a woman? Bloopers like this chip away, brittle egos. The industry typecast men to play Rocky because the cameras were always rolling. The train stopped. Another tear spilled from the safety of his eyelids. I asked, "Are you okay?" Yeah, it's nothing.
Yeah, that was nice.
I thought it was quite a useful one to think with in terms of the kinds of conversations that we're having, in terms of the kind of armour that I guess we're expected to adorn at all times when we go out, and how potentially fragile that is because it's so brittle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think about my position in work, and people are like, "Oh yeah, you can move up into management because I present as calm and steady and controlled." I think some of that's tied into my masculinity, whereas if I was coming to work and be more emotional or show tears, then that wouldn't put me in this position to move up in work. So this is the cost of being of power and not being able to show vulnerability.
So I think, obviously everybody has their own perspective of this and their own lived experience of this. But for me, that line that like you cannot show emotion, obviously, as a man, I think anybody, I've definitely experienced that, but I also have learned enough in my life to know that it's a lie, and that actually you can be an empowered man and show a lot of emotion, and that can even be that's a strengthening factor in your life, not really something that makes you weak. The fact that it will make you weaker is a lie, but it's a lie that we are sold every day of our lives, and that's an important thing to remember.
The way I've kind of seen it playing out is it's the gamble. So if you if you're real, if you're authentic in every aspect, so the feminine side, the masculine side, and you win, then you double up, because then you're the winner, and then everyone thinks that you're real, and da-da-da. But when you lose everything.
Yeah.
You have nothing else to stand on. So if you go into that particular, I'm just going to say competition, whatever the environment is, whether it's trying to step up in work, whether it's some sort of sporting event, whether it's like any form of entertainment, if you go in and you bear all and you lose, then you have no foundation to go back on, because you're just that weak guy who was soft and you're not even the best. But if you go in and you win, it's kind of like, like the quirky genius, like, oh, he's mad, but he actually knows what he's doing. It's the same kind of thing where it's like, oh, he might be a bit, he's a bit moist,
you suggest
but
that
he's actually a bit of a winner, So I think, but you did mention that, the whole social status, that you can climb up the ranks to a certain stage, where then it's like, okay, like, oh, I can talk about these things. But like you're saying, the interesting thing is, if it's a reality, why is it on the basis that we can't operate like that? Why is it not that, like, the fundamentals of teaching, like how we are getting these people into these roles, is taking that side out of it? So
I think on that note, there's potentially a class and a kind of a cultural dimension in relation to the point that was made earlier as well. So if you're inhabiting a particular class position, then those opportunities, like you can't fall quite so far, right? And you can accrue certain kind of markers from the dominant society that will afford you recognition as a man, but you can also be kind of creative with it. So potentially what I can get away with now that I've got a PhD versus when I was going to school, back when Vince would have known me when I was 14 and I was much more kind of fragile in myself to some extent, then I would have had a lot further to fall then, and I would have felt a lot more vulnerable then than now, where I've got a different kind of armor. There's another kind of armor. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? I've changed. Yeah. But what was the other point I was going to make? There was one other thing about. I'll come back to it.
So are you also suggesting that there's also something to almost gain from it as well? Like, because it is interesting as well, because obviously we do talk about it just being a negative thing, but is there nothing to gain from it? Like, do men not like being loud and like gassed and aggressive and like, and also does is it to some extent at what point does it come in useful? Like when painful things do happen in your life, like, do you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the way that I see it is like just like from a narrative perspective, like any narrative that you consume, like you can't really vibe with the main character if there's not like a level of weakness there. And it's just that same thing kind of playing out. It's like, it's the relatability. It's the fact that obviously within our own lives, like you said, we're all playing this thing out. So when somebody else does something and you're like, right, I've never been able to say that, but I know that's a truth, there's a connection that you end up getting with that. So really it comes down to authenticity, and like everybody likes risk generally as a narrative. Everybody does like ascension generally as a narrative. And so when you take the opportunity to be, so as a man, our version is when you take the opportunity to be more sensitive and to show that slightly softer side, that's the risk that you're taking. And again, if you win, people appreciate it, and if you lose, then it's not that they don't, but you're just kind of thrown back into the chaos that is society.
I was going to say on that note, in terms of maybe we can see it in terms of like the more redemptive dimensions of masculinity. Mm-hmm. So the aspects of kind of a traditional masculinity that don't subjugate, that can empower in certain ways without oppressing somebody else. I think it's important to recognize those, and I think it's important to kind of shine a light on them and bring them out. So in what context can you be more sensitive? As a father, potentially you can be more sensitive. Mm-hmm. In some areas. That kind of domain already existed. Maybe it wasn't the most kind of hands-on notion of fatherhood, but if you look throughout the historical record, then you'll find that across a whole heap of different contexts, in the Caribbean, for example, where I do my work, you find that there are countless examples of very hands-on, dedicated fathers, but they're kind of hidden under this kind of prevailing kind of stereotype image of the absent, kind of distant, uninvolved Caribbean father, right? And I think there's a whole host of different ways in which masculinity can also be kind of, or particular masculinities, particular traditional masculinities can be used as a kind of as a resource to kind of keep yourself going, keep yourself buoyant. So it's interesting, it's fascinating the number of books written about black masculinity that have the word cool in them, which is real interesting. So Bell Hooks' We Real Cool. There's another one by Majors and Bilson called Cool Pose, and there's another one called something like The Meaning of Cool. And it's interesting to think kind of, and within America, you've got a much bigger kind of literature on this, right? It's always the case with anything related to black folk, always more in America. But the idea, at least in across most of the books, is that cool provides a kind of a strategy for dealing with the kind of the chaos of life, right? And so it's kind of, if you keep yourself level, a lot of my friends, if I ask them, as in my black friends, if I ask them, how you doing? Like, just say hello. They'll be like, yeah, man, I'm cool. Or, yeah, man, I'm calm. Or, yeah, man, I'm normal. So it's always that kind of even, kind of level playing field. You're not getting yourself too kind of, you're not like, yeah, I'm great, this happened, and this happened. You're on a steady course. Because when chaos comes, it means that you can respond to it. So if you stay in that kind of even place, then you're ready to deal with some of the kind of the uncertainties and chaos that life can potentially throw at you. It's an interesting one to kind of think through.
Like the whole cool factor, and you mentioned the word code. For me, that's what I think it is, because like you say, like someone can say to you, oh yeah, I'm calm, but because the word itself is so limited, it's always about the expression. So someone can tell you they're not fine by the way they say, oh, I'm calm. Do you know what I mean? And so for me, that's what that has always been, is basically like establishing another layer so that the people around you can actually know a little bit more about you, like what you're saying, like your tendencies, because of how you normally act and what it means. But then the outside world, they would never really. So it is, I do see it's like a defensive and it is a barrier, but I think that within that, it's like, it's basically developing a new language with your friends so that you can be more expressive exclusively with them. Now, it would be a lot simpler just to actually say what you were thinking. Do you know what I mean? And do that. But it's just like a little bit of a shrouded way to kind of go around it, which weaved in is loads of toxicity in it. Do you know what I mean?
Like human beings are. I mean, we never. It's not like we always go through our lives doing everything the best possible way for everyone. You know, so that doesn't have to be.
Yeah. But also, is it what where the solutions come in as well? Because it's like, I think we're all in agreement largely with what we're saying, and I think it is deep. Like Bell Hooks, she said she's got some deep words and some like deep analysis of masculinity and whatnot. But it's like, is that the real world? Do you know what I mean? The way she looks at it, you know, like for example, like I'm sure it is. You know, she's done a lot of research, but it's like to an everyday man living their life, like how much can you actually take of what she's saying and really apply it to yourself, like in an everyday situation? So I'm just interested if you guys think about like how this conversation we're talking about, how can it actually be like implemented in like men?
Well, for me, the value is conversations like this. I mean, this is happening in a room full of people and it's being filmed. But actually, I would say promoting conversations on this kind of thing, but like in private and in pubs and in other places where people just sit and talk. That is a place where, you know, obviously at the moment that would be quite a rare thing. But you know, there's a reason why Bell Hooks doesn't just like, quite often she doesn't just talk about patriarchy here and racism here and capitalism here. She uses the term imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, which is a total mouthful, but she uses it like that for a very good reason, which is that these things are all connected and they're systemic. And you can't try to only talk about racism here or only talk about gender here and not bring that bigger picture to bear. So I think it's a long-term process, but I think encouraging people just to start trying to have those conversations and join the dots for themselves in a way where they're not being told what to think, but just kind of, maybe this is connected to this. I never thought of that, you know? Different friends have different perspectives. There's enormous value in that, I think, and just kind of connecting the dots a bit more.
That's what I think. I think the biggest value that somebody can take as an individual is what you were saying, is being able to actually come to your own conclusion. Because even when we have conversations like this, sometimes I'm thinking, some of my friends' behaviors that you may look at and say X or Y, like, I'm glad I know them and I'm glad they are who they are because of the world that we actually live in. Not like I'm individually going through crazy stuff, but as in the actual world that we are in, if there was none of that around, I think that would drive me crazy. I think that within that, like I'm saying, I see like humanity in there. But for me, that's a conversation I'm still having internally. And I think the danger is that a lot of people just kind of go through the machine and they have somebody else's expectations. So my man up there who wanted the car, he may need a car. Do you know what I mean? Like, that may be the decision that he comes to for doing what he needs to do. He may need a car, he may need a house. That might be his life that he needs to build. But if he's only in that process because he's been told, that's where the danger is. So that's why I think at least the start of the solution is to, like you said, the fact that we've had this conversation, if a group of really young people could have that conversation honestly between them, you know, the way that pans out over your life. You were saying it's like the one individual thing's not going to mess you up, the one individual conversation's not going to solve it. But if you had a generation of people where that was, you know, the consistent theme throughout secondary school going up, then maybe either actions or solutions or inventions or just like ways of thinking may come out from that. So
I think it's interesting that we're talking about repression and like sort of the ways that we respond and like act, and how that can be like a representation of how not sort of contained we feel. But then within that, there's like a level of intimacy that if you do know who you're hanging around with, then you get a chance to express it. And it makes me wonder if like, not that there isn't an issue, but maybe we exaggerate the issue because we don't see the intimacy of each group of friends, and we don't see the intimacy of each like connection that people have. And I know that even with my friends, like, the way we express some of the deeper things is quite weird and like wouldn't be noticed by anyone else, because we could be laughing about something and then a throwaway comment changes the whole conversation because we know what is meant. Do you understand? And it's sort of like we can't expect to see this boldness of like, I'm a man, I can cry, not necessarily just because of gender, but there's like an element of that's a private thing. Like, I want everyone to know that. That's not for everyone to know. Like, whether you're a man or a woman, like, you don't need to know that because that's not your business. And I think that ties into it as well.
any stereotype that doesn't actually involve making direct changes, for me, just ends up becoming irrelevant. So you get so there's a bit of a new conscious stereotype, like, you know, a little that Kendrick, like, they've done it. There is that little box there, and I appreciate that. But and it was saying a lot of these other constructs that are coming are more like what you were saying.
You mentioned Kendrick there.
Yeah, so that's what I mean.
Is there not still a lot of problematic things about like someone like Kendrick though as well?
And I hear that, I hear that, but because I'm just focusing more on the actual, like, there's actions that come with his, like, he didn't just make some tunes, it's like he's done some things, he's put out some actual messages that are in there. So I think that, and I'm just saying in terms of it being a new stereotype, do you know what I mean? Like the J. Cole, Kendrick, in terms of hip hop, where a lot of these masculine kind of instructions come from, there is like some different actions involved in that. But in terms of just generally saying, okay, you know, men should be able to, like, wear flowers around their necks, and they should, and then but that's not really, it's just creating a new box, like, that's what I agree, and it's just like a new box. But if the box doesn't involve actually making change, I think personally that the mental strain comes from, if we're talking specifically about men, about being in a society that you know needs to be changed and then not changing it, and no part of your life is gearing towards that change, and so that just ends up repressing, it goes the other direction.
I mean, there's a lot to be said for meeting people where they're at, right? Yeah. So meeting people where they currently are, and then shining the light on those things that you're doing in your everyday life that are important, or those contexts where there's certain things which you wouldn't have thought was possible is happening and it's right in front of you, but just nobody's acknowledging it. So there's a funny thing so I did my research, like we said before, in Dominica, which is where my mum's family's from, which is, for anyone who doesn't know the island, very small island, French Antilles, well, French Creole and English speaking, 70,000 people live in there. Now, the Caribbean is often represented as like the most homophobic place on earth, according to popular narratives, right? So I was fascinated because there's a guy, so I spent a lot of time, I did my research on fatherhood, but just generally just spent a lot of time amongst men in the village where I was living, predominantly working class men, just living life with them, playing football, going fishing, doing whatever it is you do in your daily life. I'll spend time with you and I want to learn a little bit about your way of life. Partly it was selfish, I wanted to learn about Dominica. Also, and it was selfish because I was doing it for my studies. And then also it was because I wanted to shine certain different lights on places that hadn't really been acknowledged, at least in Western scholarship anyway. So I was fascinated to find that there was a guy amongst the fishermen who go out every single day, and the fishermen are well respected within this particular village, called La Chichi. So I was fascinated, how was it that this man was so respected within the village in a place which I'd been told was one of the most homophobic places on earth? And it was because he was a good fisherman, straight up, just like that. And I thought that the narratives that we get is that this particular man would have been outcast, but instead he was respected and revered by his friends, despite having this name Lachichi within this context where that should, according to the kind of dominant narrative, make him like a pariah or make him someone who should be hidden away somewhere. So I was fascinated to think, well, in certain contexts where we're told people shouldn't exist or people shouldn't be able to be themselves, although it's not perfect, he's got a nickname which isn't the most flattering in local terms, but by the same token, he's still respected. He's still respected for what he does, which I thought was quite important to acknowledge those kinds of contradictions, but those kind of contradictions which give people a place to be in a particular context, to be themselves, which I thought was interesting. Anyway.
It is, but I mean, homophobia is not a rational system. It's never rational. So in that sense, the fact that you would find a hole in it is kind of a pleasant confirmation of that, really, because it's like, oh yeah, of course, it's not rational.
Yeah,
good.
I mean, it's not doing. Don't get me wrong. Like Lachichi's existence within the village as a fisherman that's respected, but also having a derogatory nickname, isn't gonna overturn homophobia within Dominican society. It's not even gonna kind of challenge the perceptions of a lot of people locally within that context. All that I'm saying is that there's a possibility of acknowledging certain ways of being male, which we're told don't exist in a particular place, or we're told can't be possible. We're told you can't be celebrated if you are this. Yet that was possible in that context, which I thought was quite an interesting and potentially redeeming thing. And that was an instance of kind of meeting people where they were at. If I'd have gone there and started chanting down homophobia in this particular context, people probably wouldn't have listened. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see what limited possibilities within a certain sphere of existence are possible. And I think the more kind of small-scale, micro-context work we do of unpicking or opening up those kind of pockets of freedom and making them bigger, I think that's the everyday kind of work that we can do.
Yeah, that's why actually
just one example.
your video, Elias, is good in that respect, because it's like it gives people a kind of comfortable space to just kind of speak about that. And be
what's really funny about that video is, I should just say it, because so it was actually part of, this girl wanted to do something on like black mental health, like a video, and she'd invited loads of people down, and she asked me and someone else, another black guy, to video it, and basically no one turned up for her like black mental health thing, and so the last guy who's like with the pink color is actually the other guy who was doing camera, and the other two guys were actually just housemates of people who lived at her house, like so. It was really random. I just thought it was just interesting because they suddenly were just so ready to like open up about their insecurities. I thought that was actually just quite admirable in a weird way. But I think it's because men are probably like, you are like you will like if you're in a safe space or in a space where you feel like you will talk about it. Do you know what I mean? It's just how often do we like have those spaces or even like want them? Do you know what I mean? Like because we have this defense mechanism against feeling like emasculated in a lot of ways. So.
I think wanting is such a funny word to use because I feel like my friends vary in the sense that I know some people are always very willing to like have the conversation that they need to have, and then you get the opposite where you know people that need to talk about something but they won't because they don't want to, and it's like what is the reason to not want to when we've created this safe space for you? I don't know, it's baffling, and like I don't really. That's just a thought that I'm throwing out. Not that I have
there's a good Grayson Perry quote actually that I mentioned to you guys, I think, before, that like talking to men about masculinity is like talking to a fish about water, like because it's just like they're so surrounded by it and exist in it that like they can't even detect it, and I think that's one of the issues that we should think about. But also, I think.
Can I chuck in a point just quickly on that one? Just interesting to think in terms of the talking thing. That we're as humans we're multimodal creatures, right? Like we've got many different avenues of potential expression. So for many of us, talking isn't the main avenue through which we express ourselves, and that's not to say that that kind of necessarily applies to, because there's some stuff. It's our dominant means of communication is talking. So talking is what we have, even if we can't write. And especially in contexts which aren't predominantly literate societies, people will be incredible storytellers in a lot of contexts. So it's important to think about in what ways, and again, it's about where we shine our light or where we position our ear to hear where certain forms of expression come through. So but like back to hip hop, like Nas's Illmatic album. Like when you listen to, if you listen to that, like if you spend like an afternoon or a couple of hours just sitting down listening to it, some of the beautiful and quite intimate things that come out through his voice as his kind of avenue for that expression, his safe space for that expression, is powerful. It's arresting. It kind of makes you kind of stand still and stops you in your tracks. So you can find avenues for that expression. And some of the work, I think, in terms of what Vikas was saying about that kind of self-care, not in a kind of capital C kind of like self-care kind of thing, like more of a kind of just a real kind of just being honest with yourself, being kind of naked with yourself in a way. That is working out what works for you, like how you can be yourself truly. Do you know what I mean? Whether it's poetry, whether it's rapping, whether it's playing the guitar, whether it's just walking somewhere, whether it's just meditating. Like it doesn't even need to be any of these kind of bougie sounding things that I've described. It can be like anything. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean actually that raises a really good point, which I think comes back to what you were saying as well. You know, and I mean, I don't know that it's how possible it is to kind of talk about this without going back to the kind of question of like labour, basically, and what it is that we do with our day and how our time is parcelled out. If you think about the fact that people's working hours there's so much duress there's so much pressure on people to kind of deliver and be a provider and all those kinds of ideas, combined with the fact that actually being a worker now in 2017 is more precarious, at least even in like developed parts of the world, than it has been for a long time. It's worse than it's been for a long time. So I think in terms of finding those kinds of other outlets, finding times to have conversations about this, finding kind of, you know, the little cracks and chinks in between where you can be more expressive. We have to remember there's a kind of cultural and economic side to that as well that's making that harder all the time. Longer hours, more alienated from your family, your friends, those kinds of things. And that's, you know, it's the picture is incomplete without that, I think.
And just to throw in as well on the tail end of that, also to think about the getting waved culture. So obviously that's a very masculine thing. That's like a set, you know, amount of time in the week is set to that. And obviously when people get smashed on whatever, that's when they open up. So there is
That's
like
that's
what I mean. There's a regular component of like going out on the weekend. You want to be with those specific people. You have, you know, you do this thing at this time, you do this thing at this time, and you will always end up, not always, but you know, you end up regularly in a place where you're sitting around, it's early hours of the morning. And then obviously the next day, the excuses that get made why you said that is where all the constructs that we're talking about come back into play. The fact that you can't just do that, have the real conversation, and then the next day when you're sober, act as if that conversation happened. But the fact that you'll then go back to that state again a week later shows that, you know, there is a value that people are finding in communication. And it is, you know, like you said, there's different times that people want to do it. And there's different ways that people want to do it, you know. So it is there. It's always creeping around, like you're saying. It's not like we're not doing it. It's just that because I still feel like the main thing about repressing humans is so that we don't actually make big changes. Every time we find an avenue, it gets put within the system. So that's why certain drugs are illegal and certain drugs aren't illegal, you know, because actually some of them open you up a hell of a lot more, but you can't readily access them. But when it comes to drinking alcohol, there's a level of opening up there, but the negatives that come with it still benefit. You're not going to wake up the next day and make real change after the hangover that you're feeling. So just think of what you're saying, you know, it's all packaged, the times of the day is there, and people do squeeze in that communication time even if it's not the best as well.